have more today than I have cards for. So if you find a card somewhere in the pew and you can give me your email address, I would appreciate having that so I can let you know. For instance, if we go back to something, like one service or something like that, we might have to reschedule. Anyway, you've walked into Basic Methodist Beliefs, Methodist 101. You can call it what you want. It's very similar to a class that you can have through the lay servant program. And I would highly recommend that you look that up online at the conference website and see where it's offered. It's offered online quite a few times a year. So if you don't like what I've said today, you can go to the source. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Eric Potter. I've been a lay speaker since 1998. And in that program, you have to take classes each year to recertify and so forth. So supposedly, I'm qualified to do this. But we're going to have Pastor Witt do one of the lessons so he can tell you where I'm a heretic. Okay? How many of you have or have read the book that was on the notice? It's called Why I Am a United Methodist. Wow, okay, we've got some achievers back here. I would highly recommend that you read this. It's it's less than 200 pages. It's $10 on Amazon. And Professor Willimon does better than I can to explain what we're going to cover in the course in a very approachable manner. Anyway, we're not going to follow the book exactly because I took this from those. So I have a reading list to give you to suggest sources and additional places you might want to look for some of this information. Let me see, I think I have an extra copy of the book if somebody would like to fight over it. Yeah, I do have an extra copy here. And if you want to look at these and decide that you like one better, I'll be happy to loan it to you because for the moment I'm finished with them. The first thing I'd like to do today is have a sex survey. SECTS, a sex survey. So what I'd like to do is find out what faith tradition you were raised in. And if you could just introduce yourself at the same time, that would help me a great deal. So CT, why don't we start with you?
I was raised in the United Church of Christ, which I'm a Canadian Protestant Ontario, Southern Ontario. I don't know where else to look at the map, but where I grew up, it was a very good church.
Okay. United Church of Christ, and this is CT Cunningham. Wilda? Okay. Wilda, Catholic. John? Okay.
My parents did drop me off at various churches, and I learned a lot from going through all of them, whether it be Baptist, Episcopalian, Lutheran, Methodist.
But they didn't,
A little bit of everything.
but Chris, they didn't go?
Nope.
Okay. Howard?
Howard Draper, United Methodist.
And for those who don't know, Howard's father is a Methodist pastor.
My grandfather was.
You're a dyed-in-the-wool Methodist. You want to come up here and teach this? Darla? Oh, I'm sorry, Ron.
This comma, I give this fellow. I'm Ron, alias G-Head. I was born and raised in a TUB. In 1965, I got a UMVC program with the United Methodist.
Okay, we'll talk about that down the road. So that's the Evangelical United Brethren, right? Okay. Darla?
I'm Darla, and I was raised Lutheran. Mary Ann, Methodist.
Stephen Trainer, daughter, born, raised, Methodist.
Okay. I can't see with masks and everybody.
Christian Mistel, raised Methodist. I went to a Lutheran elementary school. I'm raised back raised Methodist, but all of my schools said I'm Charlie Courtney. I was born and raised Catholic. Was a Baptist for a while, and now I'm a United Methodist.
Okay. That evolution there.
I'm Gary, and I was raised Lutheran.
Mary Ann?
I was born, I don't remember what confession.
Big guy?
Methodist. Baptist, Methodist.
Okay. Was your first church Methodist Episcopal South?
North.
North, okay. We'll talk about that too. Let's move on today. The first thing I want you to know is we're going to talk a lot about John Wesley, but we do not worship John Wesley in the United Methodist Church. He and his brother Charles began the Methodist movement. They never intended to form an independent church. The saying has always been that John Wesley was not a Methodist, just as Jesus was not a Christian. They started a revival and reform movement within the Church of England. And I have to say, even without the huge growth of Methodism in America, they would have been famous members of society in Great Britain. It's impossible to understand the history, traditional origins, theology, and practice of Methodism without discussing John and Charles Wesley. And one of the most difficult things I had to do in putting this together was trying to separate what makes Wesleyan theology distinctive without just talking about Charles and John Wesley, or vice versa, trying to talk about their history without mentioning where their distinctive theology came from. In the book, it talks about, it has a sentence that I think is kind of crystallizes that, which is, we stand in the shadow of John Wesley, and he casts a long shadow, but we do not worship him, and he's not a pope or a priest or whatever in the Methodist Church. Let me look historically at a few really important dates. And this is, all these slides are pretty busy, so I'll try and make sure people in the back row at least hear them. John was born on June 28th, 1703, or June 17th, 1703, because in 1703 they used a different calendar. So the 28th is adjusted for our present calendar. Charles was born December 17th, 1707. Now, I don't know, and I've tried to find out which order Charles and John were. But Susanna Wesley had 19 children. We think John was the 15th. 9 of them lived, I think, past infancy. So it was pretty common in the 18th century that something like that would happen. But if you think about it, she was pregnant for 20 years. His father was a rector of a priest in the Church of England, and he had a parish in Epworth, England. And at one point, the parish house burned down through suspicious origin because Samuel Wesley, John's father, was quite a strict priest and wasn't always looked at favorably by his congregation, so who knows. But in February 1709, there was a fire in the rectory, and everybody got out except John, who was stranded on an upper floor. And the story is that several people got on their shoulders and so forth and rescued John from the window. And forever after, his mother referred to him in words from Zechariah that he was a brand plucked from the burning, meaning that God had chosen him to do something special. Now, this is when he was 7, 5, something like that. So at that point, he didn't know what he was plucked from the burning to do. He graduated from college, and when you talk about Oxford, it's divided into different colleges. He was in Christ Church College at Oxford, graduated in 1724, and he was ordained by a Bishop Potter. So he was good and ordained as a deacon in 1725. Then his work was as a fellow, meaning not quite a tenured professor, at Oxford, and he was ordained as a priest in 1728. So 3 years between him being ordained a deacon and ordained as a priest. He taught at Lincoln College in Oxford, and while he was there, he and some friends formed something called the Holy Club. It was a place where they would come and meditate on the scriptures and confess their sins to one another and just generally try to deepen their faith. All of this was in the context of the Church of England, so it wasn't like they left the church to do this. But pretty soon, the other students thought this was pretty funny that they were kind of doing extra credit all the time. They were also doing good work by visiting people in prison and helping the poor and so forth, and that wasn't something that Oxford people did. So they got a lot of razzing about it. But more than anything, they were teased as being Methodists because they had a methodical way of studying the scriptures. And so they were also called Bible moths, which I'm glad that didn't stick and Methodists did, because I'd hate to go to church at the Church of the Bible moths. Anyway, he taught Greek, philosophy, and New Testament before he was ordained and left on a mission to Georgia. And before I go into that, let me go back to Susanna for a minute, his mother. She was kind of strict, and one of the things she described is teaching children at an early age to cry quietly. The other thing was, as soon as they could walk, she started teaching them reading. They were all raised to understand Latin and Greek. And each week she would meet with the children one-on-one to discuss their spiritual progress. They had to memorize parts of Scripture as they went along in learning to read, because their reading textbook was the Bible. So you can see, before he got to prep school or before he got to college, John Wesley had a foundation in the Bible. And he never lost that rigorous study of the Bible. Now, he went on an unsuccessful mission to Georgia. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's unsuccessful when the pastor arrives and everybody thinks he's way too pious, biblically. And you got to remember, Georgia was a prison colony, so they were not exactly pious. He went there to convert the Indians. He was completely unsuccessful in that. He fell in love with a young lady, and they would walk around and Wesley would expound the scriptures to her. That was their date. She finally got tired of him not proposing marriage and married another. John denied her the sacraments as a retaliation. Well, that didn't go over very well with the other people in Georgia, and he was basically run out of town on a rail. So he and his brother Charles didn't stay in Georgia very long. When they came back, or when John came back, there was a storm, a very bad storm, and the ship was going like crazy, and John was terrified, and particularly terrified that he was not close enough to God and would die in this situation and not be converted. So on that boat, there were also some Moravians. And the Moravians were praying and singing and basically ignoring the situation that they were in. And John was just astounded that people could have that kind of faith. So he started to have a relationship with the Moravians. And to make a long story short, he was at a Moravian prayer meeting in 1738, and a person was reading from the preface, Martin Luther's preface to the book of Romans, a real bestseller. And they were reading this in front of the group, and Wesley described it as hearing the gospel and being pierced, and his heart being strangely warmed. And he said, I knew at that moment that Jesus had died for my sins, even mine. And basically what he was talking about is he had known all of this stuff about the church, about Jesus, about all the practical and intellectual stuff, more than probably anybody else. But it wasn't until that moment that he realized that salvation was for him through Jesus Christ. He came back and came back home and went, hey Charles, guess what happened? And Charles had had a similar experience a couple days before and had been writing poems and hymns about it. So they sang a hymn together and celebrated. Now, in 1738, John did not have a church. He was a priest without a church. And you have to understand that at that time, the Church of England was the state church. The entire country was saturated in the Church of England. There weren't other churches that you went to unless you were prepared to be ostracized or persecuted or what have you. But John was without a church. And one of the features of the Church of England at that time was being a state church. The state, the king, the Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed the priests. And the priests weren't always appointed for their theological knowledge or piety or what have you. It was usually who you knew and where you could get the most salary at a particular parish. So you can see that the Church of England was not exactly infused with the Spirit. So John had a friend named George Whitefield. And George Whitefield had started preaching in the fields, not in a cornfield, but going to a place, gathering a crowd, standing up on a soapbox or whatever was available and preaching the gospel. And he said, you know, John, this is working for me. Why don't you try it? And John said, I'd rather be shot, being the proper Oxford Don that he was. But he started it, and pretty soon he was gathering converts, but John was going from place to place, so he had nothing to follow up with these converts, no way of following up with these converts. So he started the First Methodist Society and appointed lay people to lead these societies. Now, he got this idea from the Moravians. That's how they were organized. But in 1742, he was well on his way to doing field preaching all over England. And he had these societies. He would visit them every once in a while. But you can't really see that. So what I'm going to do is pass this out so you can see it up close and personal. No, I'm not. Anyway, you can see that? Okay. Eventually, as John got this process down, the Methodists formed into things called bands, which were underneath the society. And you might have 10 bands in an area. These were little groups that would take in the people who were interested in John's preaching and kind of form a Sunday school class. They had a class leader who would begin to teach them about the gospel and so forth, and begin to hold them accountable to living out their beliefs. Then they would move up to the classes. And we'll get to the rules for the classes in a few, I think that's next week or the week after. You won't believe it. If we had those rules, we'd have what, 10 people in here? Maybe. But if you were right with the class leader and you had done all that you were supposed to do and keep the rules, you could get a ticket to go to the society meeting. And if you backslid, you didn't get a ticket. So it was pretty strict as far as John's idea of advancing in sanctification. We'll get to sanctification next week too. But you had these bands and classes and societies, but these were not a religion. Everybody in them still went for the sacraments to the Church of England. And he would require, or depending on what level you were at, require proof that you had gone and were still attending church. So what about United Methodists in America? How did we get here? If this was Church of England and he wasn't forming a different religion. Well, in 1776, there was a little thing between Britain and the United States. You might have heard of it. It was called the American Revolution. It was in all the papers. And the American societies, which people had brought Methodism over to the United States, there were about 15,000 Methodists being served by 8 lay preachers. And so these societies continued after the Revolution, but they didn't have a church to go to because the Church of England skedaddled. No more clergy. So in 1784, Wesley said, how can we help these people over here who have no access to the sacraments? And what he did was he ordained a gentleman by the name of Thomas Coke. Was it Thomas? I didn't put his first name up there, but I think it was Thomas Coke. And 2 other people as superintendents for America. And they went over and they started going to these societies and so forth and providing them with ordained clergy. Now, Wesley had some theological gymnastics to go through because technically he wasn't a bishop, and only bishops could ordain people through the tracing back, the legacy back to the apostles. John said, well, you know, back in the day, other people in the churches would ordain pastors, so I'm as much as you need. Charles was scandalized by this, absolutely scandalized. And he said, you know, you've just opened up Pandora's box of problems with the Church of England and so forth. But John felt loyal to these 15,000 Methodists. He had ordained Coke and the other 2 superintendents, and pretty soon, as this movement grew, they decided they needed an organization because they couldn't rely on the Church of England anymore. So they came to something that is famous in United Methodism called the Christmas Conference. It took place at Lovely Lane Church in Baltimore. You can still go there, and there's a plaque and everything. It's very near to Camden Yards, so if you're waiting for a baseball game, you know, just take a walk down there to Lovely Lane Chapel. But in 1784, they held this conference, and they ordained Coke and a guy you may have heard of, Francis Asbury, as bishops, and formed the Methodist Episcopal Church. They adopted the same structure as the Church of England had, bishops and ordination and so forth. So we are formed in an Episcopal manner. And all Episcopal means is that we have bishops who run the place. They adopted the forms of worship of the Church of England and articles of religion that were very much the same as what the church used in England, except they had to change some of the verbiage because it said we have to be loyal to the king. So they just put a paragraph in there that we should respect the authority of our elected representatives, and then it was an American articles of religion. At about the same time, 2 of the people, well, one had participated in the Christmas conference, the other hadn't, but had been raised in the Methodist tradition. Philip Otterbein formed the United Brethren in 1800, so about 16 years after this conference, the United Brethren evolved. And also from this, a man named Joseph Albright formed the Evangelical Association. So there's the United Brethren, the Evangelical Association, but mostly they were formed because nobody was preaching to the German-speaking population in Pennsylvania and other states. So they felt they needed to have a distinctive church of their own. And an interesting thing happened along about 1790. African American attendants of the Methodist Church got tired of sitting in the balcony, being insulted, and being excluded at the same time from communion. So, in two different movements, they formed the AME, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and in New York, it was the AME Zion movement. And so those are today enduring as two separate denominations, African Methodist Episcopal and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches. Okay. In along about 1804, the Methodist movement published their first discipline. And the Book of Discipline has been published every 4 years since then. Well, why do I need to know about the Book of Discipline? Well, at some point, living as a Methodist, somebody's going to hit you over the head with this. Because it tells how we're organized, what the rules are, how somebody like Witt, oh my gosh, could become a pastor. It's our handbook. But one of the things that I'd like to recommend to you, and you can borrow mine, or Pastor Witt has one or two, is the general rules that are in here and our theological task. It's a very thin part in the front of the discipline, and it is basically unchanged from 1804. So it doesn't matter what version of this book you borrow. Those two things are going to be pretty much the same as they were for those first Methodists. And if you want chapter and verse of what being a Methodist is, that's a good read. That's a good place to start. And it's only like 80 pages. Okay. I only copied 10 pieces of all these handouts. But like I said, I want your email address, and I'll email them to you. Or those of you who are here together can share. CT, would you help me pass these out? Like I said, there's only 10 of them. Okay, here. Give Terry one. She'll take care of us. Terry, here's 2 more. And if the one that has 2 pages is too much for you, don't worry about it. Can you help me? Thanks. Okay, before we started this, CT had asked me to explain the evolution of the Methodist Church. So, oh my gosh, he's going to talk about evolution. I've already talked about the Christmas conference in Baltimore in 1784. And straight down from that is the Methodist Episcopal Church, which has been continuous since then. But there have been a lot of splits, deviations, reunifications, if that's a word. As we talked about, the African Methodist Episcopal movement and the AME Zion was formed from the New York John Street Society, so they had two different origins. Then in the 1790s, I told you about the United Brethren and the Episcopal Association splitting off mainly for German-speaking congregations. And the first split off from the Methodist Episcopal Church, the main part, for other than ethnic reasons, was the Methodist Protestant Church in 1830. Now, the Methodist Protestants didn't like all this authority that the bishops had. So they wanted laity to participate in the government of the church. So the Methodist Protestants became a separate entity. Then we're moving along, and in 1845, the Methodist Episcopal Church had a little controversy, and that was slavery. John Wesley was a vehement opponent of slavery. He campaigned for the abolition of slavery in England for years. However, at a few points, it was pointed out that a bishop had inherited slaves, and he was darn well not going to sell them. And several other preachers and so forth didn't see what was wrong with slavery. It was justified in Scripture. There were slaves in the Scriptures. So in 1845, some, 15 years before the Civil War, the Methodist Church split, and the Methodist Episcopal Church South was formed. And if you go to Epworth Church, now there's a church name. Why? That's where John Wesley was born. You'll find Epworth churches, you'll find Asbury churches. What are some of the other traditional names? I don't know. But anyway, gosh, he gets big coffee. The speed of this presentation will pick up momentarily. Anyway, if you go down to Epworth Church in Norfolk, carved into, I think it's their cornerstone, will be the words Methodist Episcopal Church South. And you can find that all over the place because they're not about to redo concrete or brick. So you find that in many churches in the South. Not all churches in the South joined the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And you were mentioning that you went to one that was a Free Methodist or Methodist? Yep. Phoebus Church near Fort Monroe was because Fort Monroe was a northern post. Well, that was the way it was through the Civil War and Reconstruction. And then, well, let me talk about Reconstruction, because in 1870, the Methodist Episcopal Church said, well, y'all are free to the slaves. We don't want you in our church. So they formed the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. And you'll find it now as the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. They changed the name in the 50s. But anyway, the Methodist Episcopal Church South and the Methodist Episcopal Church had negotiations for a long time. And finally, in 1939, the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South reunited, and also they pulled in the Methodist Protestants at that point. So that was the Methodist church that some people grew up with. Then in 1946, the United Brethren and the Evangelical Association merged to become the Evangelical United Brethren. So the church that Ron went to had formed out of this union in 1946. Then in 1968, both of those churches merged. So you had the combination of the Methodist Episcopal, the Methodist Protestant, the Methodist Episcopal South into the Methodist Church, and then you had the EUB, Evangelical United Brethren, in 1946. And when they added those two bottom boxes together, you get the blue box, which is where we are today, the United Methodist Church. Does that answer your questions? Okay, that's the evolution of where we are today. Okay. John Wesley was not that much of a revolutionary. Oh, I have another one for people. Like I said, it's only 10. And this is pretty long, but it's a condensation of some of the stuff we talked about as far as history is concerned. Now, like I said, John never left the Church of England. But the Church of England didn't like John in that he wasn't preaching where you're supposed to preach. He was encroaching on territory. Now, you may not know this, but preachers are really territorial. Pastor Witt would not like it if on Sunday morning another preacher set up shop out in the parking lot and started preaching to anybody who came by. He wouldn't like that, even if the guy was a Methodist. Well, the same thing was happening in the Church of England with John. So they ran into persecution. They ran into people accusing them of being heretics or even agents of the devil. But John continued. Charles continued. Charles wrote 6,500 hymns in his lifetime. I think it may be 9,000, but who's counting? And we have an incredible number of those in our hymn book. And really, if you want to look at the Charles Wesley hymns in the hymn book, you'll see that Methodist theology is also sung. So if you were to hear a hymn every week and it was about communion, pretty soon you'd start getting the idea of what Methodists think of communion. If you hear hymns over and over about baptism, you'll start getting what the Methodist idea of baptism is. If you hear things about, the depth of God's mercy and why he wants us saved, listen to Charles Wesley's hymn. But also, what attracts people to field preaching? Singing. A good old-fashioned, who's that playing and singing over here? I think I'll go see the band. Brought people into these meetings, whether John was preaching at the Bristol coal mines or the early industrial places or what have you. And those people had not been to church, but here was a guy who was putting words to music to some of the tavern songs that they had sung. So they knew how to sing these songs, it was just different words. And I think that's really cool. he hijacked the tavern songs from the folks down the street. The other thing that happened when John was field preaching is suddenly these people went back to work with a different attitude. Now, during John's lifetime, 1703 to 1791, in England, wow, change. Went from an agrarian culture, a farm culture, to the Industrial Revolution. So suddenly people were moving off the farm or being pushed off the farm into industrial work. There was no OSHA in 18th century Britain. These workplaces were literally hell. They didn't really care when they sent 10 miners down if 10 came up, just as long as the coal came out of the mine. The people in those factories would try to, numb themselves to this kind of work. And so over half of the business in a factory town would be taverns. And most of these taverns would charge a farthing or a couple of pence for a beer, and then charge you 2 farthings for lying on the hay in the tavern and sleeping it off. So that's how they made their money. Cheap beer, expensive hay. So John saw this and said, this is a real waste of human potential. So he started preaching to these people not only salvation, but also the idea that every man is worth an incredible amount to God. That God loves you more than you can imagine, and it's not for you to throw yourself away in a tavern. So that began John's preaching of social justice, which you didn't hear in the pulpits of the Church of England. Because he talked about a personal conversion, a warmed heart that connected to God, that was personal. Not that Jesus died for the sins of the world, but Jesus died for me. That was the substance of John's preaching. But it also was, once you are saved, you have an obligation to let the Holy Spirit change you, move you along. It's called sanctification. And these miners and textile workers and everybody else suddenly found out that it wasn't just enough to get a ticket to heaven. That these Methodists wanted you to actually come along and practice your beliefs. Practice what the Bible said about loving your neighbor, about taking care of yourself, about spiritual health, let's say. And the word is that sometimes, as these Methodist societies developed, the towns would be changed. And where you had vulgarity and drunkenness and so forth, the town very gradually pulled itself out of that. And if you can imagine that happening all over England, that's a revolutionary change. But the Church of England didn't like John's preaching because he was too enthusiastic. And I have a couple of copies of one of John's sermons that you can review as you like, but you would think them anything but enthusiastic today. You know, we think of enthusiastic as somebody pounding on the Bible on TV. That wasn't John. He was different than the Church of England folks, but he wasn't what we would call enthusiastic. But because he was talking about this warmed heart, this personal experience, he was called enthusiastic. Anyway, these bands expanded, the classes expanded, the societies expanded, and pretty soon John on horseback was going all over England. So like I said, he appointed lay leadership to these bands, classes, and societies. And that's why United Methodism was able to flourish, because you're not always going to have a priest or a pastor at your meeting. So the laymen were the heart of the church and were the ones that kept it multiplying. And that has been true of Methodism. That ethic has been true of Methodism in the start and to today. And that's why I said most of this class comes from a lay servant class that the church still offers. Do we have any questions at this point? Okay.
So the reason that John ordained people in the United States was so that the people here could receive the sacrament.
Right.
That was the key for bringing.
All of the Church of England had skedaddled and became the Anglican Church, but they were run by Americans who were part of, or at least sympathetic to the Revolution. The established Church of England loyalist priest had skedaddled at the beginning of the Revolution, so there was this gap. Like I said, if you have 15,000 Methodists and they're being led by 8 lay preachers, it's a little tough to maintain the religion, let alone spread it.
And those lay preachers could not do communion, could not do baptism, could not do the other sacraments that they had.
Right. They were basically Bible study and preaching. And that continued in the Methodist ethic or ethos through the growth of the country, all the way through the growth of the country. Who's heard of circuit riders? Okay. A circuit rider was a preacher, pastor, ordained, who would go around to churches, maybe 10 or 12 churches, and come to them and give them communion and baptize whoever they needed to have baptized. And this system enabled Methodism to expand across the entire country, because you could plant a church somewhere and have lay leadership and lead it according to the book of discipline and still get the sacraments on occasion. But it meant that these circuit riders, if you can imagine serving 4, 6, however many churches spread out all over creation, these circuit riders were tough. And John Wesley was tough too, because by the time of his death, I mean, he was the first circuit rider. By the time of his death, it's estimated he had preached 45,000 sermons and traveled 250,000 miles on horseback all over England. So he literally was the first circuit rider.
Did you run into information about how many times he knocked off a horse and seriously hurt him?
No, but
Significant. 3 or 4 times he almost died.
be studying on horseback. In the meantime, he managed to write a monthly journal that was published, transcribe his sermons, some of his sermons, so that we have them today. And like I said, if you read one of Charles Wesley's sermons, it will sound more like a professor talking in a theology class or a theological textbook. You got to realize he went back and dressed them up. You know, he did not preach in an academic manner to people. But you also got to remember that people would stick around a lot longer to hear somebody speak in those days because they didn't have TV or Netflix. What else should I say about John? He was a weirdo. He would wake up at 5 in the morning and spend 2 hours studying the scriptures and praying and getting his daily life in order. He had several times in his life where he felt that he had backslid to the point where he was unredeemable. He had many crises of faith, which really cheers me up. Not that I don't like John Wesley, but you know, the idea that he was 2 steps forward, 1 step back is very comforting to me. Well, I can't think of a whole lot more that I can tell you about history without getting deep into theology. So why don't we call it a morning, okay? Thanks. Thanks for coming. Next week we'll get into theology.